Today's topic is Egypt's diminishing wheat reserves, inflation, and the rising unemployment. My guest this week is once again Sami Hamdi. Sami is a frequent guest on Aljazeera, Arabic and English, Sky News, TRT World, and other outlets. Welcome to Restoring the Mind, Sami.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Egypt used to be at some stage self-sufficient, but then the globalization came and everything, and Egypt is now depending on other countries to provide its wheat, particularly Ukraine and Russia. But now it's like many other Arab countries is facing wheat shortages. How did they get to this place? And with the price rising, what kind of future is Egypt looking at, and what kind of precautions has Sisi's government made in this regard, do you think?
I think it's important to highlight that much of the world is reliant on importing wheat. Ukraine is often described as the breadbasket of the world, and indeed, I think the only other country that can perhaps compare in terms of its agricultural produce would probably be Sudan. But it's important to highlight that when it comes to Egypt's heavy reliance on wheat from the outside, it's also important to highlight that many businessmen have tried in the past to convert some of Egypt's land into land that can grow wheat, have found difficulties given the type of land or type of arable land that exists in Egypt, which makes it difficult to grow wheat in certain parts. The second reason is that at the time of Jamal Abdel Nasser, cotton was a particularly desirable good. So a lot of the farms that could have been used for other purposes it was decided they would be used for cotton instead. And of course, that resulted in rather a failure in the long term due to the changes to the price of cotton and the lack of demand for cotton over time. That meant that much of the land had to then be changed to other goods instead. So whereas Egypt could have capitalized on these goods before, it turned to them much later. I think that when it comes to the current crisis with regards to wheat, it's important to stress that many countries, not just Egypt, are having this problem as a result of the war in Ukraine, whether that's Algeria, whether that's whether that's Mediterranean countries, or whether it's even countries much further abroad, such as Latin America, etc. But with regards to Egypt specifically, we saw that in March this year, we saw a few weeks back, we saw the government decide to fix the price of unsubsidized bread. The idea being that because the price was beginning to skyrocket, we saw that Egypt now has introduced a fixed price that it will continue to monitor in order to prevent the price from rising even further and provoking political unrest. Similarly, we've seen in the neighboring countries or in countries in the same region, such as Tunisia, as a result of the disruption in supply by the war in Ukraine, we've seen long queues outside bakeries, and we've seen the size of the baguette that people often buy to take home become shorter and shorter as bakeries struggle to meet the demand for bread amongst the population as a result of the war in Ukraine. So there's certainly concern in Egypt, enough that now the price needs to be fixed, given that Sisi previously has sought to liberate perhaps the goods in the economy by lifting subsidies. This time now we're seeing that he's returning to a policy of subsidies in order to be able to fend off any political unrest that might manifest itself and transform into something that is similar to the Arab Spring.
Okay, but the Sisi government has kind of devalued their currency, right, and twice within the last last decade. I think in 2016 or so, and once again this year. How is that working out for the government and devaluing the Egyptian pound?
I think that when it comes to the value of the Egyptian currency, I think it's important to highlight the extent to which the currency has been supported by the government. In other words, there's much that's been said in the idea that the value of the Egyptian currency at the moment is not its real value, and that it's actually much more cheaper than it is. And this is why much of the economic measures that the International Monetary Fund has been trying to put on Egypt has been this idea of liberating the currency in order to align it closer to the market and in order to ease the pressure on the state in trying to maintain a currency. The worry, of course, for Egypt is that by liberating the currency will essentially go into free fall. And as a result, eventually lead to a situation perhaps such as we saw in Sudan in 1993, where the currency suddenly becomes worthless. But I do think that when it comes to the devaluing of the currency, I think a lot of it has to do with the negotiations with the IMF which is seeking to push the Egyptian government to deal with the Egyptian pound in its actual value as opposed to the inflated value that the government has been trying to ensure. We've also seen that as a result of the higher wheat imports, we've seen that there's increasing inflation. So there's a desire to bring the currency down further. And this is why I think that when it comes to the devaluing of the currency, it's more than just the Ukraine war. It's also part of negotiations with the International Monetary Fund. And for purists in the field of economics, it's a move that is welcomed in that the closer the currency is to its actual value, the closer we are to genuine economic reform and actually fixing the issues that plague the Egyptian economy.
Okay. But at the same time, the state is selling a lot of their assets to the Emirates, and which they have done recently again when the Israeli Prime Minister and the MBZ was kind of visiting, and I think the Egyptian banks were part of the assets that were sold, and Emirates were buying these assets left, right, and center from Egypt. What's the thinking behind it? Why is the Egyptian government kind of selling their assets to these Emirates?
I think that Egypt is struggling financially. We saw when Sisi first did his coup in 2013, we saw UAE and Saudi Arabia pump billions into the Egyptian economy in order to help the coup float. Some people have put that figure around 23 billion, but we know that at least 8 billion was given and put into Egyptian banks in order to shore up the currency fall and in order to promote confidence in the Egyptian economy at a time of particular political unrest. And Sisi has been keen to maintain an alliance with the Gulf, and the Gulf have been keen to maintain an alliance with Sisi. And much of that has involved providing the financial assistance to Sisi in order to navigate the various economic pitfalls, such as the devaluing of the currency, which brings about its own particular problems. The idea being that if you're going to devalue the currency, that exposes the currency more to external factors. So the idea being that if you receive the money from the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that promotes confidence in the Egyptian economy, which stems the decline in the real value of the Egyptian pound. When we're talking about the assets being given to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, I think that's the offset. That's about the incentive of trying to get the UAE and Saudi Arabia to continue to invest in Egypt. The idea being that if I'm going to help you out financially with the billions and billions of dollars, I do, of course, want to invest in some of the things that are available in Egypt. The thinking from the army is that even if we hand over some of these assets to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, if somehow down the line the relationship turns sour, the army can always seize these assets given that they're based in Egypt itself. We've seen in the past how the state moves to seize property, to seize assets. The Egyptian army believes that if the worst comes to the worst, it will have the means by which to seize these assets, even if perhaps it will pay a cost economically in terms of undermining investor confidence who want to believe that their assets are particularly safe. But I think it's part of this relationship in that the UAE and Saudi Arabia have been firm allies of Egypt. They've given the money to Egypt when it's needed it. They've given the money to Sisi whenever Sisi has needed it. Sisi now is implementing very tough measures at the behest of the International Monetary Fund, which is demanding that these reforms be implemented before any bailout deal or before any loans can be given to Egypt. Sisi knows that these are painful measures. He knows these are measures that might provoke political unrest. He knows these are measures that the Egyptian people will find particularly painful and will suffer particularly as a result of these measures. But nevertheless, Sisi believes they are necessary, and the UAE and Saudi Arabia are seeking to cushion that by providing the financial assistance and taking advantage of this weakness of Egypt in order to seize some of the valuable assets so that it believes that it's receiving a return on its investment. So I think it's a bit more complex than just the UAE and Saudi Arabia taking advantage. I think Egypt is aware that this is also a transactional relationship, but I think that from Sisi's perspective, he's also benefiting greatly from this relationship.
Another thing which I've seen about Egypt that is equally complex and difficult to understand is the issue of natural gas. I mean, at one point, Egypt used to export natural gas to Israel. But then I think there was some terrorism issues and some other issues to the pipeline and to the splicing system. And then Egypt ended up uh, selling the whole thing or giving away the whole thing to the Israelis, and now Egypt is importing natural gas from Israel. The roles have reversed. But at the same time, while it's importing natural gas from Israel, it is also exporting, or at least according to the media, trying to export 7.5 million tons in year 2022. I mean, how does this whole thing, importing and exporting, and you know, what's going on?
I think one thing that's worth highlighting is that 90% of Egypt's gas production is actually used domestically, and this is why it doesn't leave much room for Egypt to actually export its gas. The second point that's worth noting is that the relationship or gas relationship between Israel and Egypt, much of it previously has been governed by the peace agreement that was signed after the ceasefire, after the war between Egypt and Israel. The idea being that it was part of the concession in that Egypt's gas would be sold to Israel at a significantly reduced price, and therefore Egypt did not necessarily benefit from that relationship. The third point to note is that a lot of gas has been found in the Mediterranean that Israel is keen to take advantage of, as is Turkey and the like. And Israel over time has been able to present itself as a potential export of LNG gas. Having said that, Egypt has recently finished developing a large gas site, a large LNG gas site, and is seeking now to take advantage of the energy crisis in order to be able to start exporting. So the gas field, the Zohar gas field in particular, has the potential to turn Egypt into an exporter, in that the 90% of its current production that's used domestically, there will be enough left over for Egypt to start exporting. The issue, of course, comes in that questions have been raised in that perhaps Israel will be the prime beneficiary of this, given that there are pipelines that are in discussion of being established between Egypt and Israel, or there are already some pipelines, but rather to develop those pipelines with the investment of the UAE, which is seeking to take advantage of this as well. UAE has a keen interest in the gas that's been discovered in the Eastern Mediterranean. We know that Erdogan is talking to the Israelis and talking to Turkey's Erdogan is talking to the Israelis and talking to Egypt about establishing closer ties with regards to the gas fields. It remains to be seen to what extent Egypt will be able to start exporting its gas. But I do think that if you look carefully at the numbers, I think Egypt's awkward situation with regards to gas has much to do with the fact that most of its gas is used to meet domestic energy needs and try to keep domestic prices down, leaving it very little room to actually export that gas. But that could be changing soon this year as a result of this new gas field.
Okay, thank you. One last question about the River Nile. I mean, with over a decade of negotiations with the Ethiopians and with Sudan and Egypt, etc., nothing has come out of it. Nothing has actually, nothing constructive, nothing beneficial for the Egyptians, and I don't think there is an agreement still. No, and has Egypt lost River Nile?
I think that it's important to remember that Trump in the White House suggested that if the Ethiopians go too far, then Egypt will just bomb the dam. And I think this is something that is touted from time to time in Egyptian media as a worst case scenario. The idea being that there is a sense that Ethiopia has taken advantage of the weakness in Sudan and in Egypt in order to build this Renaissance dam that creates a large amount of electricity, quite frankly, that's capable of supplying electricity to the whole of East Africa. I think Egypt's issue with regards to the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia is not that the Renaissance Dam is a bad idea, but rather it puts the water security of Egypt into the hands of Ethiopia, and Egypt is uncomfortable with having its water security into the hands of an ambitious Addis Ababa that is very keen on restoring itself as this great major power in the region, more and supplanting Egypt as the major power in the region. The idea being that Ethiopia is not in future going to be a sincere party, and that it will at some point wield this leverage over the water security of Egypt in order to squeeze Egypt, in order to put Egypt into an uncomfortable situation. In other words, the problem is one of trust more than it's actually a problem over the validity of the dam or even the benefits that the dam might actually bring. And this is why there remains controversy as to whether the dam has yet affected the Nile, whether it is the dam that is affecting the Nile or wider issues with regards to climate change. But it's abundantly clear that Addis Ababa has not been taking Egypt's concerns seriously. There is a sense that Addis Ababa has not been giving the attention that Egypt wants to its particular concerns, that Addis Ababa has not slowed down the development of the dam in order to try to assuage or try to calm the fears of Egypt. And this is why many have touted Sisi's policy towards the dam a failure. So much so that the editor-in-chief of Ahram newspaper, the biggest newspaper in Egypt, when he criticized Sisi, such was Sisi's sensitivity that he imprisoned the editor-in-chief of Ahram, and now it's been almost a year, and the editor-in-chief is still in prison for criticizing Sisi's handling of the Renaissance dam. The reality is that Egypt lacks the leverage to put real pressure on Addis Ababa. Addis Ababa is now, I think, almost finishing the second phase of getting the dam in operation. There are genuine fears in Egypt over the ramifications of this, so much so that while many don't believe it will happen in the short term, the possibility of war becomes ever closer the closer Ethiopia gets to starting putting this dam in operation. Having said that, mediation efforts are ongoing, negotiations are ongoing, and I think that the closer the dam comes to completion, the more serious the issue will become. And it's not far-fetched that Egypt has all the options on the table if it believes that its water security is under threat. But again, it's important to stress the issue is not the validity of the dam. The issue is the lack of trust and Egypt's aversion to putting its water security in the hands of those it does not trust in Addis Ababa.
Thank you very, very much. That was my last question. Any last thoughts about how Egypt, in which direction do you think that Egypt is heading, and about its relationship with its neighbors, particularly Libya or anything? Okay. And
I think it's important to highlight that during the Ramadan when this is being recorded, Sisi is broadcasting, or Egyptian media are broadcasting, a renewed narrative of what happened in the Arab Spring, arguing that the democratic transition was a danger to Egypt, an existential threat, and that Sisi rescued Egypt from Mohammed Morsi, rescued Egypt from the Muslim Brotherhood, and rescued Egypt from these threats. The idea being that 8 years on from Sisi's coup, and he's still trying to impose and push this narrative, trying to convince the Egyptian people that what he did was the right thing, that what he did was a good thing, and that they should continue supporting him, suggesting that he is not entirely comfortable with his own position, and his continued imprisonment of those who criticize him, even those who supported his coup, such as those from the Ahram newspaper and these others who are imprisoned for criticizing his handling of the Renaissance dam. It suggests that Sisi is quite sensitive these days as a result of the economic pressures that are on Egypt, and fears a popular uprising once more that might take place within Egypt. And that's why he's very keen to end some of the crises that are across the border, whether that's in Libya, trying to promote cross-party dialogue between the parties and trying to push for a new government, whether that's with Israel, trying to essentially try to win over Tel Aviv so that they can convince Biden not to remove the aid for the Egyptian army. It's why Sisi is heavily involved in Sudan and in the transition in Sudan to ensure a favorable outcome. And it's why we see that Sisi continues to rely on the Gulf for financial support. So the idea being that Sisi's position in Egypt is not as strong as he would like it to be, and he's still in this process of trying to cement himself, using, of course, force, and hoping that things will look better in future, whether that's with regards to the gas fields and the potential for Egypt to finally start exporting gas, or whether that's in economic relief that might be brought about in a change in the Washington administration to perhaps a Republican. You'll remember that Trump called Sisi his favorite dictator, quote. But it's also important to stress that Egypt is undergoing a difficult situation with higher prices. The wheat, the bread prices are getting higher as a result of the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, according to NATO, may last for longer than a year. It may last for some time. The idea here being that Sisi's measure to fix the price of bread reveals a government that is uncomfortable, that is unsure as to how the people will react, and therefore there is a concerted effort to try to keep the peace domestically before focusing on foreign policy priorities.
So would you say that, let's say that last revolution, or 8 years ago when the Sisi came and when Mubarak was removed, that was actually also due to the inflation and price rises when people rebelled?
I think 100%. I think it was due to rampant unemployment, poverty, high prices, the difficulties in the standard of living. Same in Tunisia, same in Libya. The slogans were all about the failure to deliver on the basic standards of living. Sisi is worried that the environment is being created once more as a result of the war in Ukraine, and therefore we see that he's increasingly uncomfortable, and that's why we see the increasing crackdown taking place. This idea being trying to stamp out any flame that might erupt and create a new Arab Spring.
So it looks like another uprising is on the way sooner or later.
It's possible. I think that the lightning doesn't strike twice. I think that if it happens, it will happen in a different form from what it happened in 2011. There is this sense, whereas in 2011 there was already an alternative waiting that was the Muslim Brotherhood. This time there doesn't appear to be an alternative waiting in the wings. Having said that, though, Ibn Khaldun says, الظلم مؤذن بخراب العمران, oppression heralds the end of a civilization or the downfall of a dynasty. In this case, the more Sisi cracks down, the more there is this suggestion that something will explode and burst, if not in the next decade, certainly in the decade after.
Okay. Thank you very, very much. Do you want to tell the audience how they can actually find your, to read your articles and everything, where they can watch?
Oh, sure. You can just put Sami Hamdi on social media, SL Hashimi on on all the social media handles. The she in Hashimi is spelled in the French way, CH, not SH. And yeah, they can also go on the International Interest website, intlinterest.com. They can find out what we do in terms of the risk analysis and the like. They can get in touch. And of course, very soon we'll be releasing our own briefings that will be sent out to subscribers. So yeah, I welcome everybody. And if anybody has any questions, please do contact us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.